Never mind. You should have heard the choice of René Le Cavalier, who was the very first TV commentator of hockey matches in Montreal, and in fact uh, for the National League in Canada from October the 11th, 1952. Sports coverage in Canada has coverage media in Canada, TV in Canada has close ties with sport. The first images broadcast in public experimentally in July 1952 was a baseball match, and a number of other sporting events were broadcast before the official launch of Canadian television. Hockey matches, Canadian football, curling, and on October 11th, this hockey match, which was the foundational date in the history of Canadian television. René Cavalier worked through until 1985 and devoted himself to the Olympic Games, Francophone Games, and really was a generalist. There are three phases of television history in Canada as far as sport goes. 52 to 84, which is the development of broadcasting, TV broadcasting with Radio Canada. So a rollout of the networks and journalistic expertise. This was at a time when Radio Canada basically occupied the whole terrain, even though there was some interest from private sector. From 1984 to 2004, there was extensive rollout of private channels with pay TV, which saw the birth of the Sport Network in 1984, and in 1989 the Sports Network TSN, the Sports Network. So then to the present day we have more interest in sporting events in the third phase, where we then had explosion of coverage, but divided up between pay TV channels and also Radio Canada in the public sector, which basically left its interest in sport, apart from amateur sport and Olympics, and increasingly sport shifted to other media such as Facebook. Before going further, a few more details on the way TV is set up. Radio Canada, CBC, which produces in English and in French in the whole of the country, and then the private sector, free general interest channels and pay TV. There are a number of community-based stations, and Radio Canada is funded partly from the federal government, but it's one of the least funded countries in terms of payment per inhabitant, and also therefore sells advertising. Private channels are funded by advertising, and then the specialized channels also have money from subscriptions, obviously. So there is a major difference between Francophone Quebec TV and general Canadian TV. There's the language issue, but also Quebec television did not follow the same development as in the rest of Canada. In English-speaking Canada, right from the start, there was the issue of competition from US channels. Right from the start of TV in North America, were part of the scene for Canadians who quickly were within range of US broadcasting stations. So sport was always a big feature to provide Canadian content and attract Canadians to Canadian channels. The language barrier meant that the problem was not the same in Quebec. Right from the outset, Francophone television was extremely successful, and people quickly got connected to local stars on TV. As Jean-Pierre Desaunies said, Québécois really fell in love with television, and in particular, it was the hockey night. In this respect, this was where we have the most similarities with UK and French television. Since 1952, hockey is the largest and longest living and viewership program. On October the 11th, 1952, with 3 Canadas, it was the beginning of an entire genre and Quebec sporting journalism, which we are going to look at now. So, hockey was on radio since 1936, and Michel Normandin was the broadcaster, Mr. Hockey. Michel Normandin was known as, and they used French to describe matches, and we have a little glossary which is on the screen here. But René Le Cavalier, that we did not hear just now, who really becomes the legend in Quebec, because he defined and nailed down the francophone glossary in hockey with metaphors and expressions to describe the game. So, an untranslatable Quebec expression. Also got rid of false friends and anglicisms, which were undermining the language. So, le body check became the French equivalent. So he translated anglicisms into calques and basically de-anglicized the commentary. And many people then went on to adopt the similar linguistic rigor. And they were first and foremost journalists and presenters, and who helped to push up Radio Canada's first sports department. So this tradition was born and is still live and well and true to its roots. During matches, these commentators have the same stringency, care with language. You have to talk quickly, so good articulation is required. You need to have a specific vocabulary, and so you need to be very vigilant, visually vigilant as well. So you will then, I think I can actually see at least a picture here, will transpose the half-time pictures. So a hockey match has 3 20-minute rest periods, intermissions, and then the before match and after match time. So this program was on the radio from 1946 and adapts the hot stove league concept in the US, where hockey lovers, experts, professionals and journalists got together around a furnace or stove to discuss sport. At that time it was baseball, and in Quebec this was transposed for hockey. So this then went on to TV, and you can see they are sitting round a good stove having a good chat. What you can't hear is that, unlike Le Cavalier's language, here they roll their R's as people did at the time. The vocabulary is a bit less rigorous, and that is the same through to today, with sometimes dramatic results, as we will see. This program exists through till 1985, and the concept inspired a number of other programs. So Radio Canada was the only TV station, and then we had private channels that were set up in 1961 in French and in English. In Canada, in English-speaking Canada, there's rather more issues. CTV, John Bassett, and the owner of the Canadian Football Club in Toronto, and 6 managers of the Maple Leafs were in the team. So on a number of occasions, they would grab rights to broadcasting rights, particularly for Canadian football matches, and in 1963 the right to broadcast the second half of hockey on Wednesdays in addition to the Saturday broadcast. Télémétropole did not have the same appetite for sport. This channel, French-speaking, looked at variety shows, drama, etc. And it wasn't until the Innsbruck Winter Games in Innsbruck to have some real coverage. Innsbruck, TVA exchanged rights with CTV and tried to get into Radio-Canada's private territory, as it were. And at that time, this was a failure. The channel used the CTV image, but the journalists went up to it, the usual standards. So TVA was tried again with Lake Placid Games in 1980 and took a new enthusiasm for sport to serious competition with Radio-Canada for broadcast of the main sporting events. So of the 5 Olympic Games in which Canada was involved in the 1980s, the CTV TVA duo had the Calgary Games, and this interest for the private sector with the Olympics accompanied increasing professionalization and commercialization of the Olympic Games. Here you can see a table which shows how the broadcast rights played out. TVA and CBC basically swapped, and TVA began to broadcast weekday hockey matches in the evening from the 1980s onwards. Competition then grew still further in 1986 with the advent of a third general program in French with the Quebec national team, and in 1989 with the Sports Network, the first French sport channel. This was the summit of sporting talent in terms of broadcasting, and this made things quite complex when it came to coverage of sporting events, but there was an increase of the sporting offer in general, includes to the Montreal and Quebec hockey teams. There's a new football team, a new Canadian football team, a baseball team. When I talk about football, I mean soccer, not American football. A baseball team, and they a number of matches, 180 matches a year, 82 matches in hockey, etc. So there was plenty to fill the schedules and carve up this cake. So gradually there was more and more hours of sport broadcast, including with the advent of specialist chains, but not necessarily diversification. Hockey is most of the audience. 2016, 72% of all media coverage in sport for Quebec is for the Canadien Montréal hockey team. Through to 1985, approximately, when the old guard from Radio-Canada, which is still hale and hearty, was accompanied by some new recruits. The first transfer, a player who became an analyst who was with the Canadien team through to 1978, but he was rather an exception because generally hockey players tended to be very bad at French and could not really become communicators up to television standards, and journalists' greatest fear when interviewing a hockey player was all the mistakes they'd made. They play hockey, which really didn't go down very well. Through till the 1980s, TV looked at major events, but on the radio, there were new discoveries made. So at that time, Radio-Canada basically had the same coverage as 30 years before, and mostly male sport. And it wasn't until the 1980s that we saw the first woman on TVSQ, the forerunner of the specialized Sport Network channel. In Radio Canada, it was in 1985 that a female commentator arrived and is now one of the leading sports channel presenters for major programs, for instance. And when TSN was founded, there was another woman on the the anchor for hockey coverage, but that was not followed up much. Chantal Macabé is still the only woman assigned to hockey coverage. And then the Sports Network and other channels led to a massive increase in demand for sports images, but also for sports journalists, presenters, commentators, and the channels then look to plug the gaps by looking for new experts and look at existing personalities that were mostly former athletes, trainers, referees, and so on. And at the time, there was even a neologism. We talked about player journalists.
As from the early 90s until the 2000s, the Quebecan sports teams are going to do worse and worse. Teams left for Colorado and then Washington. Local sports personalities were delocated and leave progressively for the States. The last Stanley Cup International Hockey League Cup won by Canada was 93, and still today they are not very good. And this, of course, means fewer viewers. So Canada has to buy very costly players elsewhere. Most of the channels, television channels, will give up on sport more or less, and will stop broadcasting hockey, and all the big public channels are going to give up on it. The network that belongs since 2000s to Bell Communications giant is the only French-speaking hockey broadcaster in Canada. As from 1995, Formula One racing, and then in 2000 the Olympic Games will allow it to have access to a pool of journalists like ABS. This is the team of journalists, a mix of journalists, sports journalists, and a few former athletes. During the 2000s, very few sports events broadcast. There's not much sports coverage, but there is a new form, sports talk shows, a real revival. This is a channel that is based mainly on analysis carried out by former players, former trainers. Two different channels are going to propose in Canada their own version of this program, and in the 2000s, 3 identical programs, broadcasts, mostly men, only one woman. And all of these programs are only interested in... And then there will be a reinvestment into sport, a new specialized channel, confirming interest in the players themselves. And Dave Morissette is a former player who is more known for his punches than his skating. This is what his program is like. You're working more than you say than I thought. You were telling... This is just an example of the program that he's now running, sports program. What can you see in this extract? very poor quality of French. It's very easy to pick up on the mistakes in the French. The quality of the language is nowhere near what it used to be in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of the main players are not known for the quality of their French. There is a minority of French speakers in the league. Now there are 2 French speakers in the league, and in most of the league it's only English speaking. Some of them who want to become journalists have to learn once again to speak French. There is a humoristic publication of the best the best and worst of the players. It's music to my eyes. He's a bear. He's as strong as a horse. We won't be able to hear it because it doesn't working, but there is a radio commentator. Even if they aren't very good commentators, sports commentators. If you know the enthusiasm of Mexicans when they are describing a match, it's nothing like it. If you compare previous commentators and today's commentators, there is a resurgence of cultural identity. The players only talk about what they know about, hockey. We saw it in the previous extract. They talk about hockey in order to express what they want to say. Richard Garneau is a journalist who has covered more Olympic Games than anyone else in the world. Sports is part of culture, is a civilization element. He believes that this as high up as literature and theatre. All the disciplines of athletics. Another major stake is today is the proximity of players with previous organizations and the networks of sports organizations. Several are questioning how independent the players really are. In Canada, the owners of the big media and sports media, they all have interests in sports. This is some of these are the biggest telecom companies in Quebec. They all have investments and links to the sports world. Bell, RDS, it has shares in all the big teams. A Quebecan company that owns a lot of teams is also the owner of a major venue. Let's add that the sports organizations are very hermetic in terms of public relations. They work mostly in English and don't really know how to speak French. There's not much room for quality information, and a lot of the discourse is virtually empty. A lot of sports journalists are more pugnacious, and in magazines or on television there aren't many people who are former players who are part of the commentators today. A lot of these athletes are called on to give their convictions and their opinions. It is a suspicion that their communication skills are fairly limited, and certainly more limited than the sports skills. These are the 2 specialized channels. In terms of diversity, it's difficult to do better. Practically only white men, a few women like Chantal Maccabi, one woman for football as well, whose name I didn't catch, and only 2 women. And generally women cover tennis, because tennis, women's tennis means... notice how pallid and white the commentators are. Black commentators are former athletes on combat sports and football, American football. Not many changes in the future. Television rights for sports events will finish in 2020, 2022, and currently the trend is very strong that the new transfers towards digital stations will have an adverse effect on diversity. Athletics, ski, Facebook don't have Facebook, but the major channels, sports channels, are not particularly invested in social networks. There is not much access to sports events through social media. There's not much diversity in everything is through the same broadcaster. What about the social diversity representation and the quality of the language? These are issues that will be raised when it comes to the audience that is watching sport, watching hockey. If sports is a cultural event,